even brought them into their own country. And so this was a real big problem. To also help combat the Soviets and the spread of the Soviet Union, in the 80s, China actually also began, so not only did they open up these camps where they were training mujahideen and encouraging some of their own Muslims to join in the mid-80s, in about 1985, China actually began to open up pilgrimage to Mecca. So they started to allow some of their Uyghur Muslims and Han Muslims, they're the Hui people, they actually started to allow them to go and do their pilgrimage to Mecca, which if you're a Muslim, you believe you must do this one time in your life. And they opened this up for pilgrimage to Mecca. And but it was very expensive. It's a long journey. So only those who were supported by the people or by the government would be able to go. And a lot of times that were the imams. And then the imams would go to Saudi Arabia, and they'd go to Mecca, and they would ultimately end up being trained and taught by the imams in Saudi Arabia. Now remember, if you're from, if you're a Muslim and you're living in China and you believe that the root of your religion is in Saudi Arabia, and you go there and they say, oh, you're practicing kind of a perverted form of Islam, you need to go back to the true form of Islam. Here you are in Mecca, here you are in the Holy Land. You might be inclined to believe it. You might be inclined to say, wow, okay, so this is the real Islam, and what we're doing over there is a perverted version. So a lot of the imams that went to pilgrimage in Mecca ultimately went back to China, went back to the Xinjiang region, to the Uyghur people, and brought in an extreme version of Islam, which we know is Wahhabism. And they brought that in and started radicalizing the population even more so, alongside the mujahideen who they were already being exposed to. So there was this kind of double exposure going on, the imams coming back from their pilgrimage and also the mujahideen fighters, and all of that was starting to infiltrate the Islamic culture, the Islamic people in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. So of course, inevitably, the enemy of your enemy is not really your friend, and ultimately ends up being your enemy as well. So beginning in 1990, so very shortly after all of this began, within a 5 to 10 year window, terrorist attacks began in the Xinjiang region. These radicals would come back, or from their camps, or from pilgrimage, or from just being taught by the imams who came back from pilgrimage from Mecca. And they would believe that they wanted to live like many of the jihadists that are fighting, ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda. Many of them, they want to live in their own caliphates. They want to live under Sharia law. They don't want to live under a government. So beginning in 1990, a lot of terrorist attacks began. And of course, mixed in with this, what makes this whole thing very complicated, were ideas of separatists, of making the Xinjiang region a autonomous region for the Uyghurs only. So there were Uyghur nationalists mixed in with these Islamic extremist Wahhabi types. And so, it's kind of a blend, and a lot of those joined forces together to say, yeah, we've got the same end goal. We want to be separated from mainland China. So there was a blend of all of this going on. You can't really pin it to one thing or the other. But since 1990, there have actually been lots of terrorist attacks going on in China in that region. Starting in the 90s, there were a lot of bus bombings that were killing a lot of people. Then you move into the 2000s and continued to have bombings. Then there were knife attacks where people would walk around with long machetes and actually slice people to death. And these terrorist attacks had been going on in China. I actually had video, but for whatever reason, my system's not letting me play it, of the various different attacks that have been going on over there. But from 1990 to really up until 2016, I think their last attack was in 2017. They haven't had an attack in 3 years. But there was an attack every year, but it really heightened. It really started to escalate around 2011 to 2014. There was a big escalation in the attacks in that Xinjiang region, or sometimes they would spread outside of the Xinjiang region, but they were always, the attackers were Uyghur, who had become extremists. Now again, most Uyghur people who who are Muslims. Not all Uyghurs are Muslims. There are still Buddhist Uyghurs, there are secular Uyghurs, but most Uyghurs who are Muslim are not Wahhabists. They are Sufis. They are also under attack. They are also viewed as infidels, and they're the ones who are being terrorized by these extremists inside of their own country. They're being terrorized by groups that believe that they're the true followers of Islam and these Sufi Muslims are not. That's what makes this so dangerous. So again, China being very, very secretive, and Asia